Tracing the lineage of Medan's Hokkien language. Lu instead of li or le. In Jakarta and surroundings, one could hear more of gua or gue and lu or lo commonly used rather than aku and kamu. When asked, they would most likely explain that it was borrowed from Betawi dialect, referring to people of Batavia or Old Jakarta. Most would have figured out that they are some of the many loanwords from Bahasa Tionghoa, Indonesian term for Chinese language. For many, Hokkien language and Bahasa Tionghoa are synonymous and interchangeable, as the presence of Hokkiens in Java has been long and overwhelmingly dominant. In 1878 to 1883, the group as sinologists traveled to Java and Borneo. He made the observation in 1880 about the Chinese in Java. The center of the homeland of Java's Chinese is the city of Changzhou, on the north bank of the Dragon River, at a distance nearly 35 English miles from Amoy. Apart from the Chinese from those regions, immigrants will still be found in Java from Quanzhou, but the majority of the immigration, we repeated, comes from the banks of the Dragon River. Of the few Hakkas, Hoklo and Canton Chinese who have settled here and there, mainly as workmen, we do not mention here. They do not belong to Hokkien, speak completely different languages, have different morals and customs, and are regarded as foreigners even by their own race mates in Java. They are therefore perhaps of this land, with the exception of Batavia, not yet native at all. For many Indonesians, including Chinese Indonesians who do not know much about Minnan language and their subdialects, it is easy to presume that Lu is a common term for you in South Fujian. That is far from the truth. In fact, the sound Lu for you is an outlier, a sound specific only to certain parts of region of Southern Fujian. The presence of Lu or Alo for you in not just Betawi lingo but throughout Malaya and Nusantara is consensually agreed to be a substrate from the old Peranakan Creole Chinese pioneers, who first came to the Archipelago and established the earliest Chinese communities which thrived and survived up until this day. The Great Migration. In 1815, Chinese population of Surabaya was only 2,047. In 1910, it nearly reached 15,000. In 1920, it shot up to the number of 25,290, and in 1930 to 43,239. In 1815, Batavia had 11,854 Chinese. In 1893, it grew to the number of 26,569. It nearly tripled in 1920, up to 74,151. And in 1930, it reached 6 digits at 112,261 people. In 1826, John Anderson carried a diplomatic mission to Delhi, Old Medan, and encountered very few Chinese. In 1910, it had 6,397 Chinese. In 1912, it had 10,997 Chinese. In 1920, it had 15,916 people. And in 1930, it reached 27,287 people. As a contrast, Chinese population of Penang in 1804 was 3,000 people. In 1833, it grew to 11,150. In 1871, it grew more than triple to 36,382. In 1891, it doubled to 87,920. In 1911, it became 111,738, and in 1921 at 135,288. When comparing the growth of Chinese population in British Strait settlements to the cities of Dutch East Indies, the Great Migration of Malaya Chinese began in early 1800s, while the mass migration of Nusantara Chinese only began in late 1800s. In the case of Batavia, Chinese population stagnated just above 10,000 from 1700s until the end of 1800s and quadrupled in the beginning of the 1900s. From the group's observation in 1880, Changzhou Hokkiens, who once dominated the population, was soon to be greatly diminished by the influx of coolies and traders from different regions of Fujian and Guangdong. In 1881, census of the Straits settlements began to shed some light on the ethnic demography of Chinese population in Malacca, Penang and Singapore, classifying the ethnic groups as Hokkien, Highlands, Kek, Macau or Cantonese, Straits-born or Peranakans, and others. Dutch East Indies surviving Volksstelling in 1930 broke down the ethnicity into Hokkien, Hakka, Teochew, Kongfu, overheard Chinese Lanarden or other Chinese race including Peranakans, as well as Niet Chinese Lanarden or non-Chinese race, presumably indigenous wives, and Onbekend or unknown. According to the map of the southern coast of China in Volksstelling, Hokkien represents the whole province of Fujian, including Putian, Fuzhou and Fuqing, as well as the Longyan Hakkas. The demography of Chinese in Java, unlike in other islands, was dominantly Hokkien and Hakka. Considering the strong presence of Fuzhou and Fuqing people in Java today, it can be presumed that they were included in Hokkien category in 1930s Volksstelling. It is rather intriguing considering the Dutch distinguished Cantonese from Teochew and Hakka despite being from the same province, yet not the Hokchews, Hokchia and Putianese apart from the Hokkiens. Either their mass migration came after the Volksstelling, or that there were political motives to merge those mutually unintelligible language groups together. Nevertheless, it can be agreed that the presence of Hokkien in Dutch East Indies significantly dwarfed the rest of the other Chinese ethnic groups apart from the Hakkas. All Peranakans Lu in Medan Hokkien. Many Indonesians assume that Changzhou Hokkiens survived as a substrate in modern Indonesian and Baba Malay lingo due to the sizable percentage of ethnic Hokkien in the population. However, in places such as Malacca and Singapore, the sheer number of new Hokkien migrants of other dialects such as Amoy and Chuantou instead caused the extinction of the older Changzhou substrate. Aside the Peranakans, Lu is used much less compared to Li or Le in present-day Singapore and Malacca. Therefore, a sizable percentage of ethnic Hokkien in the population can be a double-edged sword and is not a supporting factor for the survival of old Changzhou Hokkien substrate. In Medan's case, the rise of the young city, one that is much younger than Surabaya and Penang, happened in the midst of great Chinese migration, way past the era of dominance of Changzhou pioneers. How could it be possible that a population with less than 50% that was of ethnic Hokkien, with even much smaller number of those of Haicheng, Tong'an origin, used Lu instead of Li or Le? What made it more perplexing is that Lu in China is spoken only in certain parts of Changzhou. Even if majority of Chinese in Java and Malacca in 1800s were of Changzhou origin, not all of them came from that particular region that uses Lu instead of Li or Le. That could be proven through few supporting materials. Surabayan Changzhou, Di, He, and Li. As you can see on the menu, the romanized spelling of Hokkien, despite of some Hokchew dishes, is undoubtedly of Changzhou, but that is of different Changzhou dialect. Pig is spelled Di, fish is spelled He, squid is spelled Jiu He. The E endings above correlates with Li, which is one of the few characteristics of Greater Changzhou region dialect. This might suggest that presence of Lu in Betawi dialect might most likely be older than Surabayan Changzhou Hokkien, older than the Medhurst's Dictionary of Hokkien. Walter Henry Medhurst travelled to Malacca in 1819 to study Malay and Chinese languages, and later served as missionary to Penang in 1820 and to Batavia in 1822 until 1843. He finally published the Dictionary of the Hokkien Dialects of the Chinese Language according to the reading and colloquial idioms, partially published in 1832, which later revised and completed in 1837. It is seen as the first ever English Hokkien dictionary, knowing that Medhurst compiled said dictionary based on his experience and interactions with the local Chinese of Malacca, Penang and Batavia without having been to China prior. The dictionary itself is a reflection of a standard lingua franca spoken particularly by the Chinese in the Straits. It might also suggest that there wasn't a great standard dialect of Minnan, namely Changzhou Hokkien, spoken in Malacca, Penang and Batavia. Evidently, the Hokkien spoken in Malacca and Batavia in early 1800s were of Changzhou dialect, but one which agreed with Surabayan Changzhou dialect. The Lu, Tu, Hu Changzhou dialect variant most likely did not come from the 1800s. In fact, during that time, Malacca Peranakans had begun to speak Baba Malay. One of the most characteristic traits of the patois is the use of gua for aku and lu for awa. However, Tan Chi Beng also provide glossary of Hokkien terms used in Bawang Malay which conflicted with the characteristic U ending. The presence of two differing types of Tangto Hokkien variants might suggest that the introduction of the E ending variant became standard in the 1800s, when the Babas interacted with the Tangto-speaking newcomers and absorbed the newer dialect. It might be possible that Lu might be introduced later instead, but that logic clashed with the history of Yegang and Haicheng's district prominence as a seaport until its decline in 1700s. Could it be that Lu might have come from the diaspora prior to the 1800s? Haicheng Tong'an dialect. In my previous article on the history of Medan's connection to Penang, I have elaborated of how most of the earliest Penang pioneers were of Haicheng origin. Geographic explains that many of what is today a part of Amoy was once a part of Haicheng County. In fact, as mentioned, Amoy was not a part of the equation since its prominence as a port did not come about until 1700s. Amoy originally belonged to Tong'an, Tanghua County. And the group also mentioned that even up to the late 1800s, Amoy served as nothing but just as a gateway to the hinterlands. The location of Haicheng County adjacent to Tong'an County during Ming and Qing period might have suggested a strong cultural pull, separate and partially resistant to Changzhou's and Quanzhou's influence. Diagram depicted the extent of the old Haicheng County, covering a substantial part of today's Xiamen and connected directly to Tong'an. It is important to clarify this, as it is known that only Haicheng and pre-Xiamen Tong'an predominantly used the ending U for Lu, Tu, and Hu. This same hypothesis was also suggested by Russell Jones in his paper, The Jiangju Hokkiens, the True Pioneers of Nanyang. The loanword Lu for you, which has come into Malay from Hokkien, has puzzled researchers, for it occurs in the home dialect of very few Hokkien Chinese. It seems to occur in only a very small geographical area, confined to the north part of Amoy Island, part of Tong'an, and neighbouring parts of Jiangju. I have discussed this at some length already, and would only add two remarks to that. When I visited Chia Kongsi in Penang in 1995, the chairman Mr. Chia Jin Tiong also told me that the Chia family temple is at Haichong, near Shima. Significantly, he confirmed that in Haichong, the pronunciation for the word Yu is Lu, not Li. This adds weight to the second point, that it is likely that the more detailed research would prove a link between the earliest influential Chinese immigrants to the Nanyang and the widespread use of the form Lu. Cash says Douglas in his 1873 Dictionary of Vernacular Spoken Language of Amoy with principal variations of Jiangju and Jinju dialects also distinguish the difference between Amoy, Tangto, Quanzhou, and Tong'an dialect. Please note the description provided by Douglas. T represents Tong'an dialect. A represents Amoy dialect. Vowel U clearly should not be mistaken with and that is particularly present in Jinju and parts of Tong'an. Aside from the U versus E dichotomy, I would also like to point out and assert the distinct difference between Amoy and Tangto, particularly the mutation of the ending versus Oi, seen clearly in the table provided by Russell Jones. Reconnecting Medan Hokkien to the early Haicheng Tong'an pioneers. Unlike the Bahasa Melayu and Bahasa Indonesia, Lu in Medan Hokkien is not a borrowed word, but rather a part of predominantly Haicheng Tong'an dialect substrate. Aside from the Malay loanwords and the more recent Teochew and Quanzhou influence. Before it was cool, the term like Kepo have always been a part of Medan Hokkien instead of Kuepe. The origin of fundamental Medan Hokkien derived from its Penang origin, as countless sources have proven that a great majority of early Medan Chinese migration hailed from Penang. The language itself predated Chinese diaspora to Tanah Delhi, and also predated the time when Francis Lloyd acquired Penang Island. Ko Lei Huan, a native Tong'an and a Tian Ti Hui society rebel, fled to southern Siam to establish himself as a prominent figure in the genesis of Penang as a strait settlement, as he brought Chinese and Malays of Kedah to build the island. It must also be understood that prior to that, Chinese have long established its foothold in Sitamarat and Patani. The Kukongsi of Penang claimed the presence of Kus in Penang and Kedah as early as mid-1700s, and that there were at least 30 Ku clansmen in Penang between 1786 to 1800. The Ku also mentions of the history of their clansmen in Burma, Siam, Taiwan and Batavia. Their origin is of Samto, Haicheng. The other big Kongsi such as Chia and Tang were established in 1810, while Lim and Yo in early 1800s. The founders and their ancestors would most likely have settled long prior. All of those clans were of Hai Tong origin. Based on this knowledge, Medan Hokkien's linguistic lineage could be traced as far back as a century prior its beginning, or perhaps even further back. In the paper previously mentioned, Russell Jones cited that in Sino-Malaysiana selected papers on Ming and Qing history and on the overseas Chinese in South Asia 1942 to 1988, Frank discovered that early Chinese tombstones in Ambon dated up until late 1800s mostly of Changzhou origins, of which become mixed and thereafter dominated by the people from Yongchun, a county in Quanzhou. The founding patriarch of the elite Han family of Lasem, 1673 to 1743, claimed to have come from Changzhou as well, whose descendant became powerful Capitan and Mayor de Hinezen of East Java. Another elite land-owning dynasty, the prestigious Khus of Tambun, came from Changzhou as early as 1769. The Oi of Simongan dynasty also hailed from the nearby Tong'an, as well as Sobeng Gong 1580 to 1644, the first Capitan de Hinezen of Betawi. One could only wonder if the linguistic lineage of Medan Hokkien might somehow be connected to all those early Peranakans. In 1783, Ong Tai Hai ventured to Java for 10 years and subjectively described his experience there, as well as the Hokkien transliteration of some local terms. Some of these terms have survived in Penang and Medan Hokkien until today. Lok Kun is a Medan Hokkien term for Western doctor. However, the term itself originally came from Dukun, while Chinese doctor is called Sin Se. The evolution of the meaning Lok Kun might suggest that the progenitor of Medan Hokkien lived in a place where Chinese people had to resort to consulting witch doctors and eventually saw Western medicine with the same lens of mysticism. Soka has always been one of the most iconic characteristics of Straits Hokkien. It is difficult to imagine that it took within just 3 to 6 generations within the span of 150 years for the Chinese in Medan to forget the Hokkien term for to like. Unlike some interchangeable code switches in Medan Hokkien such as Tambo instead of Ke, Kawan instead of Peng Yu, Toka instead of Wa, Ganggu instead of Zoluan. It is also a very common and universal expression that is found in Hokkien dialects and does not need to be replaced without a good reason. Suka is such an essential and powerful human expression, and the notion of a whole population, predominantly recent migrants, completely forgot the original Hokkien term is enigmatic to say the least. What is the historical link between Kedah Chinese who founded Penang and the Chinese in Malacca and Java? It was known that in the same years when Dutch East Indies captured Malacca, 1641, they also secured trade monopoly as well as tin mining in Kedah and southern Siam. A most plausible connection would be the link between Kedah Chinese and Malacca Batavia trade, until Malacca was ceded to British in 1842. One strong clue is that both Dukun and Suka are Malay words, and that the use of Malay in tandem with Hokkien is a trait of the old Peranakan pioneers, be it in Java or Malaya. A language older than its people. Without further evidence yet to suggest exact origins of Medan Hokkien, we are left with more question marks and a very broad stroke of historical location and time frame. Just like a Rubik's Cube, constant re-evaluation of this paradigm will bring us closer to a clearer answer. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. One thing we can confirm is that Medan Hokkien language predates the mass arrival of Chinese in Tanah Delhi in mid-1800s, and that the historical value of the language and its prestige is critically neglected, particularly by those who speak this old tongue, and who are completely oblivious of its origin. To end this video with a sentimental touch, I would like to point out that some of the most emotionally precious expressions in Medan Hokkien are Malay loanwords. Words like janji, sayang, suka are very essential features of Medan Hokkien language. Medan Chinese have completely forgotten the original Hokkien words, and therefore is canonic and irreplaceable. In a way perhaps quite poetic, those 3 words represent cross-cultural gestures in the heart of multiculturalism. Once upon a time, sometime, somewhere in the past, a Chinese person attempted to convey their feelings to someone who did not speak Hokkien. Slowly, from time to time, the weight and the value of those words became greater and greater, passed on from fathers to daughters and from mothers to sons, and its meaning became much greater than it sounds. Janji, for promise, because the value of a promise is sacred, and to janji is to make an unbreakable oath. To break it is to betray your people, your identity, and your culture. Suka, for like Because things that we like are truly unique and local and cannot be found anywhere else. Because when we like, we suka. We put our passion and soul in it, and we are proud of it, no matter how flawed it might be. Sayang, for care or love. Because the sound of love from your loving family cannot be replaced by anything or anyone in this world. And the love is passed down from one generation to another and becomes bigger than life. To sayang is to become a home for someone to return to. For us, restless wanderers and eternal migrants.